Welcome to another episode of History for Higginites with me, Sean.
And me, Max.
We will be asking the question of how did the Chicago race riot of 1919 influence and change Chicago, their black population, and other riots? So first, what was the Chicago race riot of 1919? The Chicago race riot had two very important moments, what led to the riot and its effects after.
So it all starts on July 27th, 1919, when a 17-year-old named Eugene Williams was hanging with his friends at the beach on 25th Street. He and his friends had built a makeshift raft to float on around the lake. They would get on the raft that day and begin floating down the lake. They would eventually drift too far and end up at the beach on 29th Street. The beaches weren't officially segregated, however, the 29th Street beach was considered a whites only area. On the beach was a 24-year-old white baker by the name of George Stauber. Upon seeing the raft with the boys on it, Stauber would begin throwing rocks at them. One would hit Williams in the forehead, knocking him unconscious. He would then sink into the water and drown.
Some first-hand accounts from African Americans really show how segregation and just the social views were put together to be against black people. Now for some quotes to express the struggles.
Quote by John Turner Harris. The funny thing is, I didn't question it. If you don't want to be bothered with me, I don't want to be bothered with you. They had their little beach, and they were welcome to come over to ours any time they wished. And they did, when they wanted some seclusion. We were not allowed over there, because there was always a fight. Nothing I wanted was over there anyway.
Another quote to show this: kids would always have to collect a group of kids, because if you went individually and ran into a couple of white kids, you would end up with a bloody nose. Quote by Chester Wilkins. On top of this, tensions were already high because of the demand for housing because of an influx of black migration, approximately 44,000 people. So when people heard the man that stoned the boy didn't get arrested, crowds began to gather on the beach.
This is when the riot began, as a fight breaks out between mobs and gangs of both races. For 13 days, even after calling the state militia by the fourth day, it was in chaos, had no order, and violence continued.
By the end of the riot, 38 were found dead, 23 African American, and 15 white. 537 were injured, while 1,000 black families were made homeless. With this horror being made public, the world was shocked to the point that the president, Woodrow Wilson, stepped in to say that white people were the aggressors. People began to make efforts to bring racial harmony through things like voluntary organizations and legislation.
The violence eased Thursday with just a single killing. On Friday, no deaths and only one injury were reported. But the mayhem was not quite over. Around 3 or 4 a.m. on Saturday, fires broke out in the neighborhood west of the stockyards, burning 49 houses and leaving 948 people, mostly Lithuanian and Polish immigrants, homeless. Arson was suspected.
Another first hand account shows the extent to which the riot was taken.
Commission member George Cleveland Hall, a 55-year-old black surgeon at Providence Hospital. I am proud of this city, but not always proud. I am not proud when I remember that the homes of 27 Negroes have been bombed and no steps have been taken to apprehend the criminals. I am not proud when I remember that not a single civic organization has taken a definite stand in protest against these outrages. The Negro is silent, but he is thinking. He cannot be expected to remain patient forever under these continued attacks.
What did the black population do? Well, in response, the black population was now more willing than ever to stand up for themselves and fight against discrimination. As the Chicago riot ended, Chicago's black leaders advanced an interpretation of the riot that claimed that armed defense of one's rights and property demonstrated both manhood and fitness for citizen. So how did the Chicago race riot contribute to other riots?
After the Chicago race riot, conflicts continued. A total of 25 more riots would happen after. Some notable riots that happened shortly after were the Washington, D.C. riot. This riot began after a black man was arrested for assaulting a white woman. It escalated into violence, resulting in the deaths of 15 people and injuries to hundreds.
The Knoxville, Tennessee riot. A dispute between black and white workers at a steel plant led to clashes. The National Guard was called in, and 7 people were killed. The Longview, Texas riot. Racial tensions erupted during a labor strike at a local oil refinery. The conflict resulted in the deaths of 4 whites and 5 blacks. The Phillips County, Arkansas riot. Sharecroppers demanded better wages, and working conditions. When they organized, white mobs attacked them, leading to the deaths of over 200 black people. As you can see, the Chicago race riot had a huge impact around the United States, to the point that the president had to mention his opinion, while also sparking other black people in other states to stand up for themselves against oppression.
How did Chicago change in terms of politics and infrastructure?
Well, Chicago as a city was left with multiple decisions to be made politically and infrastructurally. For infrastructure, some suggested implementing stricter zoning laws to formally segregate housing in Chicago while also bringing restrictions on white and black people working together.
These changes were not very enforced and never got to have their intended full effect. As for changes in the political climate of Chicago, multiple civil rights organizations and groups were made, like the Chicago Urban League and the Commission on Race Relations. On top of this, African American voters began to be more organized and influential in their local politics.
Then, the city's white real estate agents helped pioneer new tactics in segregation. By 1927, the Chicago Real Estate Board had drafted its own version of a restrictive covenant, a binding contract enjoining white homeowners from selling property to non whites.
Of the history of black people before and after the Chicago race riot of 1919. The Great Migration brings a significant amount of black people to Chicago, with their reasons being economic job opportunities. Black communities in Chicago began to thrive, like in Bronzeville in the south side of Chicago, where vibrance of culture and life showed.
Chicago was then already facing segregation in housing, employment, and education. Housing in particular was very limited for the African Americans on where to live because of the housing covenants. After the riot, racial tensions began to rise with the loss of property and lives because of the fights. Organization of communities began to be made as a way to demand and fight for social justice and civil rights. African American voters were now more politically active and sought greater representation, which then led to Chicago's first African American congressman, William L. Dawson, in 1943.
Was there any important media that came from the riots?
Media after the riot captured its important moments to show the rest of the United States the seriousness of it. For example, newspapers began to document the violence and destruction, while photographs also showed the event in better detail. With this, commentaries with the riot also brought outrage and push for change in social dynamics of black and white people.
How did everyone respond to the riot?
The response to the riot included changes to law enforcement, community activism, government action, national attention, and cultural/social impact. For the response and law enforcement, they tried to immediate ways of restoring order, but were met with criticisms because of the allegations of bias and lack of help in protecting African Americans from white mobs.
Communities were brought together, organizing protests, advocating for justice, and demanding social reform by doing rallies, marches, and meetings in ways of bringing unity. The Chicago City Council and other bodies responded to the riot by starting hearings, commissions, and investigations to find the cause of the riots and violence. But the effectiveness of the investigations varies, as many were too slow to materialize.
According to some first-hand accounts from African Americans, some white people in Chicago changed for the better in response to the riots.
Quote from Arthur G. Falls. One of the things that interested me was the sign of respect with which white people dealt with us. Perhaps because they also understood that we were armed. I think also that we detected a certain amount of friendliness on the part of some white people who were apparently very ashamed of what had happened and had a feeling of at least sympathy for those who had been subjected to this outburst.
Quote by Julius F. Taylor. Many of them had never spoken to us before, and they clapped their hands with gladness every time that we arrived home, safe from downtown. In response to the riot, national attention focused on the racial tensions and sparked discussion over not only African American groups, but other minorities as well. While in Chicago, social and cultural changes were now having a lasting effect on the image of Chicago, bringing in their African American culture and resilience, making it the city's image.
Cover the question on how the Chicago race riot of 1919 influenced and changed Chicago, the black population, and other riots.
Yeah, so as we can see, the Chicago race riot of 1919 helped influence Chicago and their black population in many ways, most if not all for the better. On top of this, it had a big influence on not only other riots, but the United States as a whole through cultural, political, and social changes.
Well, that's it for today's episode of History for Higginites podcast. See you guys another time.
And don't forget to tune in for more episodes, coming never.